Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're discussing how to cope with loneliness and isolation in law school. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Conference. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about something that comes up for a lot of new law or even seasoned law students, which is being lonely or feeling isolated in law school. Now, at first, you might think this sounds crazy because your law school campus is going to be filled with people, right? But at various points in the law school and bar exam experience, it's definitely normal to feel isolated or lonely. And these feelings can become problematic when they lead to problems with happiness, productivity, or sometimes you even start going down that road to being clinically depressed. So to start us off, Lee, were there some specific moments in law school that you remember feeling really lonely?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. In fact, the first one that comes to mind is second semester of my first year. I got the flu and I was super sick. I had this really high fever. I was sitting in class and I started seeing double in my professor. So I turned to my friends and I'm like, I think I need to go to health services. So I wander over to health services and I'm like, I'm super sick. And they're like, you have the flu. And I was like, oh my gosh, you have to give me something. I'm in law school. I can't be sick for very long.
Like, I can't have the flu.
I can't have the flu.
I'm in law school.
Yeah, exactly. And so they gave me, some cough medicine or whatever. And so I have to go to Walgreens now. I'm still super sick, sitting in Walgreens, drinking Gatorade and Tylenol or whatever. And then go home. And then I realized that there's no one to take care of me because I lived alone. And I had no food in the house.
Oh, God.
I had I just had nothing and I didn't even know what to do. And I ended up ordering soup from the Chinese food place literally across the street for delivery because I just didn't want to even leave my building. And they're like, don't you live across the street? And I said, yes, please bring it to me. I just really need you to bring it to me. So
I just need someone to take care of me even if I'm paying you.
Exactly. And it was, I don't know if it was a law school loneliness moment or I'm an adult loneliness moment where you realize, that you're on your own and you're taking care of yourself. But, it was kind of a shocking moment when you realize that you're kind of dealing with this hard thing, but you were really kind of all on your own. And I mean, it was, I was fine. A few days I was back at school, but even just staying home from school for a few days and not really having contact with anyone, feeling like I was getting behind in my studying and things like that, it really did make you feel like you were kind of off on your own. And it's not a good feeling.
No, I had a similar scenario when I was in architecture school in grad school where I got the stomach flu from some rotten tomato at the cafeteria at the school. And I have such a clear memory of being in the grocery store and I'm puking all over the thing. I'm just I keep throwing up. And I'm I've got to make this stop because I have to keep working. So I'm I have such a clear memory of being in the pharmacy aisle of the grocery store in Berkeley and looking for something that'll make you stop throwing up, which of course is not really, I think they did sell something. Mm-hmm. And so, I bought it and chugging it in the parking lot and I'm puking beside of my car.
Oh my God.
And it's not working, of course, because why would anything like that really work? And I remember going into the studio and I'm so sick. And I did have friends at least there. And this one friend of mine turns to me and she's like, you have to go home. I'm like, I can't go home. I've got so much work to do. And she's like, you're going to throw up on your project. Mm-hmm. And think about what that's going to look like. You're going to have to start over. And there was that moment of clarity of oh, she's right. I really need to go home. But yeah, the feeling of wandering the aisles of the grocery store, so sick and not having anyone that you can rely on. Of course, people probably would help you if you asked them. Mm-hmm. But you don't want to bother anyone. And you're just in that place where it's just so horrible. And you're I can take care of it on my own. I'm fine.
Yeah. It's so true.
You're not fine.
And I also think what happens to law students, I was lucky because I had lawyers in my family that I could talk to or friends who'd already been through law school. But I talk to a lot of law students who are the only person in their family that's attended law school, that don't have a lot of people who've gone through this experience. And when things happen or they get rough or stress really gets high, that it can be a really lonely, kind of frustrating place to be when you don't feel like you have a support network when you're struggling.
No, I mean, I didn't have any lawyers really in my family. I mean, like my godfather or something was a partner at a law firm, but my immediate family, there was no one I could call if I'm like, I don't really understand like how to read a case. Mm-hmm. I was basically left to sort of find a book and figure it out on my own.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not a great feeling when you're like, wow, I really just am in this experience and don't know who to talk to or like what to do about this.
And I think a lot of people can kind of discredit the feelings of stress and anxiety and intensity of the law school experience if you haven't really lived through it. Some people just say, well, it's just school.
Yeah, like, why are you getting so upset? It's just
right.
school.
Why you just, or you got the flu,
for me,
just stay home from school for a few days. Who cares?
Yeah, like, what's the big deal? Just miss class.
Right. And you're like, no, you don't understand. If I don't do, like, I can never make up hundreds of pages of reading. Like, you don't, like once you go down, you can't.
Yeah, you're going to be at the bottom of a very deep well at that point.
Exactly. And so it can be very hard when you don't have people you can reach out to that are really understanding your struggles. And you're going to stumble in law school. I mean, we've talked about this a lot over the episodes of the podcast. And so finding your support network and being able to reach out to people can be really important. Another thing that I think is tough is a lot of people, from a practical perspective, they relocate for law school. And so,
that was me. I moved from San Francisco to New York to go to law school, and also had a boyfriend at the time for the first semester in California. And so I think that, on the one hand, that might be a source of support, but it can also be a source of loneliness because you miss the person. And then also, as you were just saying, like a lot of times they just don't get it. Mm-hmm. So it's like, well, what do you mean you can't talk to me every night for an hour? And it's like, I don't have time for that. Right. And so then, you're screwing up your pre-existing relationships and people are upset about that. And, it can become pretty quickly like a bad place.
Yeah. And the other thing, I think sometimes people can imagine that you just show up to law school and you find these fast friends. I don't know, in the same way that maybe a lot of us felt like in undergrad we did. But law school is definitely different than undergrad. You're not all living together necessarily. Everybody's got their own lives. Everybody's different ages and comes with very different experiences. It's not like going back to college. I didn't.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think sure, like hopefully you do meet some people that you connect with, but I think it's definitely different than like, hey, we're like going to show up and have nothing but parties for like the first month and we're going to make all of our new best friends. Like that's just not really, it's a more serious sort of experience. And, while hopefully there is bonding that goes on, I think it's unrealistic to think that, you're going to be as tight immediately as you might have been with your freshman year friends.
I think that's true. And everybody comes from such a varied personal life too when you get to law school. I mean, you'll have people who relocated, you have people with kids, you have people who commute. You have, one of my good friends from law school drove 45 minutes to school every day. So she wasn't around campus a lot.
I think people just have more complicated lives, typically being a bit older. Yeah. I mean, even 5 or 10 years, between being 19 and being 29 is a pretty big difference.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So it can just change the dynamic. And sometimes you don't know what experience in law school is going to be that place where you do make friends. I mean, I made some really great friends when I was on the board of the law review, people that I didn't really know at all through law school, but we didn't meet till we were 3Ls.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that happens your first year is maybe you meet some people at orientation that you think you're going to be great friends with, but then if they're not in your section, you almost don't see them.
Right.
So it can be really hard, I think, to maintain relationships across sections and things like that because they're just, these are not the people that you're seeing on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's harder for introverts to connect with people sometimes in law school too?
Well, I think in general, it's probably harder for introverts to make friends initially. Mm-hmm. I mean, the good news is I think most people in law school are actually fairly introverted on average. So, you might find out that you can make friends in a study group and you guys sit quietly in the library and study together and you barely talk to each other, but you feel like you have that connection to someone. Might actually be easier for an introvert.
That's true. And then I think you have the situation which you were just talking about with like your long distance boyfriend, that existing friends and family may be disappointed that you can't give them as much time as they want. You might be feeling pressure from them. Maybe they're pulling back from you because they feel like, you're not as available for them. It can create a lot of, complicated emotions and feelings by just your relationships that are existing when you start law school that are strained because of the law school experience.
Yeah, I read an interesting description of what loneliness is the other day. And basically, I forgot who exactly it was that said it. Sorry, plagiarizing. But basically the idea was that loneliness has nothing to do about being around people or not being around people. What it really has to do with is you're not getting the sort of intimacy that you want for some reason. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really good way of looking at it, where it's like, why am I lonely? I'm surrounded by all these people. Like, I should be happy. I should be making new friends. But, if you're missing someone, or like you feel like your relationships are strained or whatever it is, it's normal to feel kind of down or lonely a lot of the time, even though you might be surrounded by all these people that theoretically could be your new best friends.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it sounds like most law students are going to go through some period when they might feel alone or isolated.
Well, I think it's really common.
Yeah.
And I think people can struggle with it because oftentimes it feels like maybe you're the only one and everybody else is going out to bar review every Thursday and they're having such a great time. But some of those people are probably self-medicating with alcohol.
That's true. That's also a common thing we see in law school.
Yeah, I think you do act, and I think this is a serious point. I think you do see these sort of maladapted reactions to these feelings that people may not either be experiencing directly or they don't want to be experiencing. So you see things like people start acting out in other ways, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good catalyst, though, to talk about what people can do to feel less isolated or alone, hopefully that don't involve self-medicating.
Yeah, and we're not saying there's anything wrong with going out and having a beer with your classmates. That's not a problem.
No, we're big fans of that.
Yeah, that's a great, I think that's a great way to sort of meet people. And if you find, I think, particularly if you're introverted, I think it can be difficult to sort of make yourself do these social activities that a lot of law school does revolve around. So, and at my school, they had a bar review every Thursday. And, sometimes like I didn't feel like going to that thing. I was like, God, like I have to get dressed. Like I'm so tired. I just want to stay home and watch TV. But typically, I think even people who are more introverted find that they actually enjoy being out in the world, at least in limited quantities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So I think it can be good to kind of make yourself move out of that comfort zone a little bit, at least.
For sure. I think that is a really good point. And, maybe even look for outings that maybe even themed or around something that could be more interesting to you. Like if you're really into wine, I'm sure that at some point your law school will have some sort of a wine outing or a wine bar outing or something like that, where you could try and even find a subset of people within your law school who maybe even share a non-law school interest that you can kind of bond
or,
with.
Like getting involved in some sort of pro bono project in a structured way where I think if you're feeling really isolated, it can be useful to take on some sort of responsibility for other people so that,
That's true.
It's like, well, I actually can't just stay home and watch like a rerun of 8 episodes of Sex and the City because I have to go to, family court and help this woman, or I have to go to, whatever it is, like do the Social Security appeal or unemployment appeal. And I think, that gets you out in the world. It gets you interacting with people. It can make you feel, like you're being more useful to the world, which, can help with this sort of like isolation and loneliness. And, if you're getting dragged down in that, a lot of the pro bono stuff can be really good because if nothing else, you have to talk to people. No,
it's very true. And, as much as we all like a good wine bar, doing something good for the world, that's another way to meet people.
Yeah, exactly. And if nothing else, like you get to feel good about yourself.
That's
You're
true.
Like, I like went down, and it's interesting. I mean, it's not going to be boring.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot, for sometimes in law school too, like a lot of this sort of like lonely disaffectedness also is just kind of boredom.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the reading, like kind of is a drag after a while, and you're just like every day is sort of one after the other. And if you can shake it up a little bit, I think that can get people like out of that funk.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I also think if you're kind of ODing on law, that it can also be really helpful to just look into your community and even look for other volunteer opportunities or do a team in training, join some sort of exercise classes, boot camps, or, CrossFits or yoga. Allison loves taking pottery classes.
Yeah, and like in law school, I always made sure that I had some sort of exercise class through the gym at the school. Like, it was cheap. It was usually pretty interesting. And again, like, was it like was the best use of my time going to my squash class? Maybe not. But if it's like you're getting exercise, I became friends with the guy who was teaching the class, things like that. Like, it's just this, even a low level of sort of like positive interaction with other people can be really helpful, particularly outside of law school.
For sure. And you might find that it actually helps your sanity to remember that there is a world outside of law school and talk to people who aren't in law school. I think especially if you've relocated somewhere and you only hang out with law students, it can be really nice to talk to people from the outside world and get a bit of a reality check.
Oh yeah,
bring
absolutely.
You back.
Yeah, and I think, scheduling these things so that that every Monday at this time you're going to go to this yoga class or something, that can also help mentally, so that when you're kind of like, oh, like, I don't have any friends, I never talk to anyone, I never leave the house, you can kind of look at your schedule and be like, well, actually, no, on Monday I am going to do this, and then on Wednesday I do have this other group that I go to, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Just to kind of give you that touch point of like, no, you're actually not totally by yourself in this experience, and, there are other people who are interested in talking to you.
And I think you can even use the same kind of strategy with friends and families. You can set up standing, dates with people, whether it be phone dates with your long distance significant other, or weekly dinner out with your best friend who might be in town, or, whatever it might be, or your family, or you do Sunday night dinner with your family, whatever it might be. I think it can be nice to just build those into your schedule. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot on the podcast and with all of our tutoring students is the importance of, having a working study schedule, but it might sound crazy to schedule in these times for social activities, but it's not, because you need to protect them just like you protect everything else.
Yeah, and also it gives you something to look forward to. I mean, this is one of the reasons, if you read studies about like why it's better to spend money on experiences, it's not just that you have the experience, it's that you get to look forward to the experience, and then you get to reminisce about the experience after you have it. So, maybe you're having a really crap week and it's Thursday, but if you look at your calendar and you're like, oh yeah, right, like every Saturday I have this group of people who get together and they have a potluck dinner. That's going to make you feel better.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very true. And I think that just your potluck dinner reminder is a good note that it doesn't have to be like an expensive experience outing. It can really be, a Saturday night dinner potluck group, or, everybody gets together and someone, they bring different types of wine, or you do a movie night if everybody's in independent films, or whatever it might be. It's just more important that you set aside that time so you can connect with people and do something fun, get out of your own head for a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's great. Another idea is, if you have the time, maybe some sort of part-time job, especially one that's not necessarily related to law.
Yeah.
Even something as simple as like babysitting occasionally. You're like, oh, that was kind of fun. Like, I get to be a kid again and like play with people.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting. Sometimes when I'm at the park with my kid, I'm always like, yeah, this would have been a great like part-time job. You can just like go to the park. I mean, you might have to play with kids, but that's fine. Kids are funny.
When I went to boarding school, when I was in high school, I was in boarding school, and it was actually really nice to babysit sometimes on like a Friday or Saturday night, because you got to go to someone's actual house and like, hang out with the kids and like make dinner in a real kitchen. And that could be kind of a nice break, particularly if you're living in sort of a dorm environment or something like that.
For sure. And I was an SAT tutor, and I was in law school, and that used a completely different part of my brain. But I also liked it. It was like getting out of the law school bubble, and it was being helpful. It was in a way, what you were talking about with the pro bono stuff. I got to add value, help these high school kids in a way that I didn't feel like I was being helpful in law school because I didn't know what I was doing.
Right. I think that's one of the reasons people get sort of beaten down, is that there's a lot of uncertainty. And the feedback, if you're getting any feedback at all, is often not that positive. Like maybe you're getting chastised in class for not knowing the right answer. And it can really, shake people's self-confidence. And I think finding a way to sort of get out there and feel some level of competence, whether it's mastering a different yoga pose, or, beating your personal time at the running club or whatever, or like helping someone in some way, can be really beneficial.
Yeah. I think if you're also having trouble finding, people to interact with on a person-to-person basis, there are definitely online communities that you can reach out to. I mean, we do that with some of our Start Law School Right workshop students. I think a lot of our tutoring students like to have kind of a law school pal type person that they can ask, questions to. That's kind of a safe place. But using your professors at law school, who you might have a connection with, to try and talk through some of these issues with as they might come up, or brainstorm solutions, or just to connect with people, I think is really wise.
Well, and I think this is a place where a study group can come in handy too. I mean, you and I are not necessarily the biggest fans for study groups for actually studying. I mean, sure, some people they work great for, but you don't have to join a study group. But if you're feeling like you really spend all of your time by yourself, you're studying only in your house, whatever it is, if you feel like it would be helpful, just even have people. You don't even have to study together necessarily. You could just go and sit in the same room and kind of commiserate for a few minutes and then get to work. I think that can be valuable.
Yeah. I think it's also really important to know that all of this stuff gets worse when you are exhausted. Yeah. And you're not taking care of yourself. And
right. I mean, once you're tired and you're emotionally depleted, then it's when the stuff can really start to spiral.
Yeah. So that's always one of the first questions I think you have to ask yourself when you really start to feel like you're getting down in the dumps, is, am I taking care of myself first? Because if you're not, you can't be a great law student. You're not going to be able to connect with other people because you're in kind of a negative place. And, they always say, or I think it was a mommy blog, but was sending around this image of, you have to put on your own oxygen mask first before you can help anybody else. Yeah. And I think it's true. And
I think people have to think about what works for them. I mean, if you know that you're super introverted and it's going to drive you crazy to go out to a bar, okay, fine, don't force yourself to do that every week.
Right.
But if you know that you're really extroverted and you're bored out of your mind because you're in school with all these introverts in law school, you think about ways to connect on other parts of the campus. I mean, most of my most extroverted friends didn't really hang out with law students. They went to the business school event and made some business school friends. And, those people party.
That's true.
Or the LLMs. A lot of the LLMs were foreign students and they didn't care what grades they got. So they went out every single night. So occasionally, particularly by my third year when I was all right, I kind of don't really need to spend that much time on class anymore. Those people were fun to hang out with occasionally. So you can think of other places besides just the people who are in your section, which, I mean, frankly, you're going to get really bored with those people probably pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think it's just important, and we, of course, say this over and over again on the podcast, but when you really decide that you're super struggling, you need to reach out to professional help and get it. I mean, if you are really depressed, just going to a mixer is probably not going to fix it. It's time to call the therapist. The school will often pay for it, or there's some sort of
I would say you don't even
have
to be super depressed. Just do it before you think you need it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you feel like you don't have anyone to talk to, go use your school's free therapy resources. You'll have someone to talk to.
Yep.
And they have to listen to you,
Yep, exactly. So I think it's always worth considering, and it's just important to, be a little self-aware that when things all of a sudden don't seem like they're getting better, it's time to reach out for help.
Right. And the thing is, you don't have to ideally reach this crisis point. Everyone gets that law school is really stressful and overwhelming a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. So if you show up to the student health or the student psychological services or whatever, and you're like, I'm in law school, I'm feeling really down about it, I'm feeling a lot of stress, can you help me? They're not going to be like, oh, that's really unusual. What are you doing here? We've never seen this before.
Right. You're like, oh, you're just like the last 5 people I talked to.
So. Yeah, and I think, the thing is, it's, you're signing up for a stressful profession. And I think it's just better typically to get some coping skills early on before you end up in that cohort of unhappy lawyers who have drinking problems and end up, having a DUI. And it's just a bad spiral.
That's true. So, I mean, if I was a zero L or somebody who's just starting law school listening to this, I might be starting to wonder if it is just practically impossible to be happy in law school.
No, I don't think it's impossible. I think it can be difficult.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of factors that align against that. But at the same time, there are plenty of people who are pretty happy in law school. There are plenty of people who find it interesting and maybe they struggle sometimes, but they get through it and they find ways to cope with that. I think it's pretty rare. I would say it's rare for anyone to be, you'd have to be like really off the charts on the happy scale, I think, to be happy like all day, every day in law school.
And that's true. I think there's a lot of grind to how it's set up. And of course, it's high pressure, right? We've talked about the fact that you have typically this one exam. It's very competitive. And of course, when you're selecting your law school, keeping in mind environmental factors about how the school's culture is, where the school is located, things like that can be really important to help your happiness factor.
Yeah, so I think certain schools are known for being like very high pressure places. Other ones are known for being nicer. I think that's a totally legitimate concern. I think, weather issues are often underlooked. Like if I'm in law school in Miami, I'm probably just going to be inherently better off in terms of like psychology than if I'm in law school in Chicago in the winter,
Yeah, I think
not to say
that's
that
true.
Not to say that you don't go to Chicago, but if you're choosing two equally, prestigious places and one of them happens to be in a place you'd love to live with great weather, like that's a valid thing to think about.
It is. The other thing that I think a lot of people don't think about is campuses where most of the students commute. And especially if you're relocating to a new town where you don't know anybody and it's kind of a commuter campus, it's going to be a lot harder to make friends because
I think that's a tough scenario.
Yeah, it's a tough scenario. And
it's not to say you can't do it, but I
No.
think you've got to think through in advance, like, well, how am I going to connect with people inside or outside of the law school?
Yeah.
And maybe, it's an afternoon lunch on Thursdays or Fridays or whatever that you set up. But you've got to really think strategically. You can't just kind of show up and be like, oh, everything's going to be great. I'll somehow meet people.
Right. And, and so when you're selecting your law school, I think it is important to keep these things in mind. And you should ask students, when you're a prospective student, how the social life is. What, do the law students go to weekly events? Are there lots of networking events? Because I think a lot of the students will be pretty honest about what the culture is. Or it might possibly be like, well, a lot of students live, some schools in LA, a lot of students commute in like a half hour to school because that's just
that would be like nothing in LA.
Yeah. And so you're not going to probably have bar nights right next to campus. Or if your school is located in a neighborhood that maybe isn't conducive to bar nights, then that's not going to happen. You just have to be really aware. And I think, be thoughtful and ask these questions because I do think they can, really key off happiness. I know for me, staying in San Francisco was a big part of deciding where I wanted to go to law school. And that made me happy. So, that was, and
for me, like I'd always wanted to live in New York, and I had like a number of good friends who were in New York who I could kind of parachute in, and if I really needed somebody to hang out with occasionally, I could go to Brooklyn and hang out with some of my best friends. That's really different than if I'd gone to school someplace like that I didn't know anyone.
Yeah. And I think for me, one thing I had to always remind myself in law school, and I think it's really easy to lose sight of this, is going to law school is a privilege, and it is something you're doing voluntarily, and it is still years of your life. And if you are truly, truly miserable, then maybe you need to evaluate if this is going to be a successful path for you. Because
absolutely.
The law as a practice is different than law school, but it's got a lot of the same characteristics, I think.
Yeah. And I think, it can sometimes be difficult for people to sort of honor their own happiness, but I think it's a very valid thing. There are plenty of people who have left law school and been perfectly successful in life, and they would look back and say, yeah, leaving after the first semester was the best decision I ever made because I know this was not something that was going to make me happy. And that's something to keep paying attention to. And also, just in terms of like jobs and things, like what kind of jobs are you interested in, and, trying things out and really evaluating, is this working for me?
Right.
Is this something that's going to make me happy in the long term that I could see myself doing? And if the answer is no, then you've really got to think seriously about your career choices, I think.
Yeah. We talk about the importance of defining your own success. Law school is also going to pressure you to be defined by their constraints of success, be it a big firm job or straight A's or being on the law review. And those aren't necessarily going to match up with everyone's individual definitions of success. And so it's important, to even go through an exercise and write down your own goals. So when you feel pressure to be defined by other people's definitions of success, you can be like, no, I'm good. I've got my own. They're in my pocket or my iPhone or whatever.
And, some of that I think comes down to even like how you want your relationships with other people to be. So, say that you're lonely because you would prefer to have a significant other and you don't. Well, that's a good first piece of information to know about yourself, that okay, I can identify this is one of the reasons I feel lonely is I would like to have a partner. Well, then it's well, how are you going to do that? You have to make time to go on dates and this sort of thing. And that's a completely valid use of time, but you're going to have to really block that out.
That's true. And make that a priority. And you can actually meet people in law school that are, you have time to do things like internet dates or go to mixers or go to meet friends at dinners or whatever that might be. You just have to carve out the time to do it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the, dealing with the loneliness issue is just really identifying the problem. Maybe you're lonely because you live by yourself and you've never done that before and it's making you sad. Well, maybe you should find a roommate.
Right. Or get a pet,
Yeah, exactly. It's oh, well, I'm sad because I never leave the house and all I do is study. Well, maybe this would be a great time for you to, foster a dog that you're going to have to walk. I mean, maybe not make the permanent commitment yet to the dog, but, try it out and then, or borrow your friend's dog to go on a walk or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's just important to be creative and think about different ways that you can add, little amounts of happiness to your life. And, I think we mentioned this earlier in the podcast a little bit about the bar exam. We're recording this right before the bar exam starts, and so it's, of course, on my mind. But a lot of people, when they study for the bar, also find it very lonely. Now, a lot of the prep courses are online, so they're just people are watching videos at home and studying on their own. Maybe they're living by themselves. Maybe they are even, living away from their friend group. Even for the bar experience, it's very important to make sure that you're doing all of these things we've talked about, making time for friends and family to connect with people, checking in with other friends,
just being deliberate
and recognizing that, you don't have to, sure, you're not going to be as available as you would be if you weren't studying for the bar, but, you don't have to say, bye world, I'll be back in 2 months.
Yeah. I just don't think that's great for anyone's psyche necessarily.
No. And if your psyche is in a really, negative place, you're not going to be as productive at studying, and you're probably not going to be as successful on the test as well.
Yeah, I mean, you have to take care of yourself if you're going to be able to function throughout the whole semester in law school or throughout the several months that you're studying for the bar, if you're just going to be able to literally keep it together without cracking up.
Yeah.
And that's the clearest recipe for disaster.
Yes.
I mean, if you're so lonely and alone that you're spending hours a day crying in your room, that's not good for anybody.
No, it's not. And then, life is what's happening right now. It's you don't want to say, well, I'm just going to decide that I'm just going to be miserable for these 3 years because it's just 3 years of my life. I mean, 3 years is a long time. It's a lot of life is happening in those 3 years. And
and if it's even something as simple as taking a walk in the afternoon or taking a bike ride, if you have to go someplace and you don't feel like taking your car or your taxi, even these really little things getting outside, getting some fresh air, getting a little bit of exercise, having something that's sort of fun go on, they can make a huge difference.
Huge difference. And I think another thing that people have to also be careful about, especially because a lot of people listening to this, it's election season. I feel like every time we do a podcast, I have to talk about the election. But I think that it can be really emotionally exhausting to be very connected right now. Be on Facebook. My Facebook feed, which used to be full of babies and vacations.
I can't even look at it anymore.
I know. I have a lot of friends who've completely shut down their Facebook accounts because it's so negative. And I think that, if you're starting to feel a little disconnected, spending all of your time, it can be very easy to start spending all your time online and then kind of go down the rabbit hole of negative things. I don't even know.
Yeah, so you have to be really deliberate about sort of protecting yourself from, and it's not to say you can just basically be screw the world, I'm not going to pay any attention to anything. But there is, there's studies that show repeated exposure to negative things in the news is just not good for you.
Yeah.
And you can't do that to yourself if you're already in a place where you're kind of going down this negative spiral. Reading about, how the world's falling apart and all these people are being killed everywhere is really not going to be helpful.
Yeah. Sometimes
so you're going to be better off
turn
it off, go get an ice cream, take a walk,
Yeah.
Get some perspective.
It's true. And it's very, very hard. I mean, it's, turning off even news notifications or Facebook notifications on your phone can be huge.
Oh, yeah. It's like, why is that? Yeah. I mean, I get like the New York Times notifications on my iPhone, and I'm like, why am I getting this notification about like a bunch of people were killed in Germany? Like, yes, this is horrible, but like, is this helpful? Is this like
in the middle of my lunch,
Yeah, exactly. It's like, exactly. You're just like, this is not helpful.
No, I mean, like, of course, like you want to know what's going on in the world, but it has to have a balance. And I think that it's so easy to get sucked into this cycle where you just feel negative about everything. And so
yeah, it's not helpful.
It's not helpful. I mean, I know there are movements on Facebook now. I saw one that's like everybody's supposed to post songs to Facebook.
Yeah. I was just thinking it's too bad they don't have like a filter on these app notifications to be like, I would only like good news, please.
Well, then we wouldn't get any New York Times notifications.
Exactly. Well, it's the thing. Like it bleeds, it leads, Yeah. But yeah, I think particularly in law school, particularly in an election season, like you have to be really, again, deliberate, judicious about protecting your mental energy for these things.
Yeah, it can be very taxing.
And if you're feeling really stressed out about the election or whatever, like do something productive, like join a voting rights organization. I mean, I remember when I was in law school, I think it was the second George W. Bush election, and I went to Ohio on the election day and did like voter, protection. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that was like kind of crazy and stressful a little bit, but it was also like, it was really interesting, and you're in a community and you were doing something. Like you weren't just sitting home being like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Oh my God. Like you were out actually doing something. And I think that's kind of step one for a lot of these problems.
I think that's a really, really good thing to think about. And, that goes back to like volunteering for a group or finding your community. If you're passionate
about a campaign.
But if you're passionate about some of these issues and you feel like you need to be doing something, be selective and then say, well, okay, I'm going to go to this event that's coming up because I can be with my people and feel like I'm contributing. And
yeah, I mean, that's a great way to, no better way to find a community than to join a political campaign.
That is very true.
It's like you might meet your partner, you're going to meet some friends, like you're getting mentors, you're doing whatever you believe in. Like if you're feeling lonely right now, go campaign.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
They'll be happy to have a law student. I can guarantee you.
That's true. And at least then the people you will meet will likely be, you'll have a lot in common.
Exactly. You're going to be like-minded.
Exactly.
By definition.
Yes. In fact, I have a friend too. It wasn't a political campaign, but I have friends who met and got married by working next to each other at a food bank volunteering day.
Yeah, another great option.
Yep.
Food bank, always good.
Always good.
You're never going to walk away from volunteering at a food bank feeling like you're a terrible person.
That's true.
And you'll have some perspective.
That's true. That's very, very true. Well, with that, I think we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Episodes are typically released on Mondays. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or Alison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.